Welcome, everyone, wherever you are. I'm Safwan Masri, Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development. And today I'm joining you from Amman. The Amman Center was the first of Colombia's 9 global centers. And I must admit, it occupies a very special corner of my heart. Amman is the place of my own birth, and so perhaps I identify with the whole notion of coming into being from this particular locale. But beyond this origin story, the Amman Global Center is the site of years and years of fond memories, both professional and personal. Here is where I have met and joined with so many colleagues and friends and students, my future colleagues, and where we established a sense of family. It's here that my time with Colombia Global Centers started 13 years ago. And it is here in Amman where I have chosen to close out the final month of a rewarding 34-year, immensely enriching and rewarding career with Columbia University before I transition to the next chapter of my life at Georgetown University. Colombia will always be in my heart, and I will always be a Colombian by virtue of the profound memories and lasting relationships I have formed. So this moment carries with it a particular poignancy, which is only amplified by the purpose of our gathering today. Over the next 60 minutes, we will hear from 7 remarkable students, each of whom has completed a year-long journey of scholastic discovery. They have produced a collection of essays that capture, explore, and reflect upon the university's complex historical relationship with the Middle East, which includes the varied lands of Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine. These students, under the aegis of the Amman Center, engaged with academics and experts on topics ranging from Orientalist thinking to feminism across cultures and the complex relationship between events in the Arab world and campus culture. The resultant publication is entitled simply Columbia University Ties with Arabs and the Arab World, and it casts a critical, discerning eye over decades in which the preconceptions and biases of the West, which of course includes Colombia, have attached to Arabs and the Arab world. This is a substantive achievement, and it most likely would not have existed without the Amman Center. At the time of the center's opening in 2009, Jordan offered enormous opportunities for research and engagement and provided easy access to the rest of the Middle East. The Global Center immediately began establishing dynamic partnerships that benefit students, scholars, and society at large. Ongoing alliances with numerous local, national, and international organizations have had an enduring and perhaps even transformative impact on child and family welfare, public health, poverty alleviation, teacher preparation, juvenile justice, and sustainable development, to name a few. But it is not my intention to conflate the achievements of these student scholars with those of the Center in Amman, which may have opened doors and minds, but did not create the publication we are here to discuss and celebrate. This is their product, your product, and this is their moment. It is a thrilling one for each of them, perhaps, but really for all of us. There is nothing as rewarding as witnessing education working, as watching students provided with resources, support, and the right tools emerge into scholars with fresh perspectives, insights, and expertise. Their pursuit of a more expansive and truthful context to the material we pass on is an urgent necessity in today's hyper-connected and yet desperately fragmented world. These students remind us once more that we are global citizens, actively participating and influencing life everywhere on this planet. To you, the students, the scholars who have produced this publication, I am incredibly grateful. But I am also grateful, and we are all grateful, to Dana Beatty, who is here with us on stage today, who curated the entire project, who gave it her heart, her mind, her soul, and really immersed herself into producing this phenomenal publication. So our gratitude, Dana, goes to you first and foremost before we hear from each of the students. And with that, Dana, I very happily turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Safwan, for the moving opening remarks. Thank you for your kind acknowledgement. We're very glad to have you with us at our student publication launch event. This was very much driven with love for the topic. And we hope that this publication illuminates the diverse snapshots of the Colombia-Arab connection over time. But it is by no means comprehensive, and the topics chosen are entirely driven by the student interest areas. Our 7 Columbia student authors applied through our Columbia Global Center's virtual internship program, and their passions for this topic was crystal clear from the start. That same energy carried through over weeks and months of researching, analyzing, drafting, and refining until we have this final publication that is ready to share with you. It was a phenomenal experience, honestly, working with each and every student on this project. And we're happy today that we're joined by 4 of our 7 student authors. I will be introducing each student in the sequence that their paper appears in the publication, which is chronological order. Unfortunately, Suhani Chaudhry, Ala Qaruni, and Sophia Fulton are unable to be with us. I would also like to mention that the publication is designed by the wonderful Yara Youssef in Beirut. And I would also like to thank everyone at CGC Amman and Professor Safwan yourself, who made this publication possible, as well as the CGC Rio. They have their own Colombia Brazil history publication that was just inspirational. I'd also like to thank everyone in our virtual audience for being with us. Please do send in your questions through the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen. They will be addressed in this event. The publication itself is now available on our website, and we'll be sharing the link to access it below. I'd now like to introduce Lydia Helou, student author of The Colombian Gaze, Readings of the Arab World. Lydia is an incoming PhD student at NYU in the Department of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies, where she aims to study the history and mechanics of sensory memory in the Arab world. After growing up between Beirut and Rome, Lydia earned her double degree in history and political sciences from the Sorbonne University before completing a dual master's degree in international and world history at Columbia University and the London School of Economics. Her research took her on archival adventures across the globe, from Addis Ababa to the Vatican's secret archive in Rome, where she focused on the post-colonial history of medicine and gender in East Africa and Southwest Asia. Lydia, if you'd like to start us off.
Thank you so much, Dana and Professor Safwan. It was so great to hear both of you. So yes, my essay looks at the Colombian gaze, or an idea of how Colombia scholars have read and defined the Arabs through textuality and methodologies that varied around different times at Columbia and on campus. And so my research was structured around mainly the interviews of different actors at Columbia, and a lot of archival research done mainly remotely because of COVID, but very interesting nonetheless. And it was for me a fantastic chance to interview a series of people around the question of what Arab means, what Arabness can be for different people from different backgrounds and historical realities. I obviously got a myriad of responses that show the polysemy of the world and also illustrate the way Colombia wants to reply to one crucial question, which is what kind of relation it wants to maintain with the Arab world, what kind of Colombia it wants to be in Jordan, in Lebanon, and everywhere else in our region. And I think it also illustrates the idea of Colombia replying to these questions via multiple centers and institutes that all emerged at Colombia between the 50s and 3 years ago, that continue to complexify the idea of what Arab means. And in this specific essay, I'm mainly structured around 2 main moments: the very early years of Colombia's interest in the Orient and the Bible lens, the 1880s, and the moment where Colombia in the 1950s and 60s and even later on started to engage with the Arab world as an actor of a contemporary history, not just religious text or sacred, untouched textualities. And for me, it really started with the stacks at Butler Library, where I found the hidden manuscripts of Colombia, which was a series of Arabic scripts collected by peregrinating Orientalists in the 1880s, that brought back these texts to Colombia to study them as religious texts or just as aesthetical artifacts, spectacularized, put under glass, and never really read. So deprived of their textuality, their very soul, raison d'être. And for a long time, these texts that couldn't find readership at Columbia were simply forgotten. They weren't on a catalog or anywhere to be seen. And we had to wait for the work of fantastic librarians and archivists that took the mission to even self-learn Arabic to make these texts visible. And for me, this essay was a sort of odyssey of these texts, from being read as images to gaining back the text they were meant to share with the world, to finally becoming part of a political narrative that Colombia continues to shape with time. And it was really like a chronological, I would say, description of all the characters who really worked to make Colombia one of the, I think, the best post-colonial icon in the academic landscape in the US, and how this was made through the idea of making Arabic visible and relevant in academia. And this was done through many characters, but one of them was the 11th student Philip Hetty, that earned his PhD at Columbia in 1915, and who was a bit tired of saying Arabic as just, you know, a witness of the past or like stuck in unread manuscripts. And it's at Columbia that this fantastic Philip Hetty started a huge revolution, a nahda, we could say, of a very Colombian-made nahda. And how it, I think I might have disconnected.
No, we can hear you.
Oh, okay.
You're with us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
And how Philip Hetty really tried to demonstrate that Arabic was not just a language of religious study or aesthetical value, but really an actor in contemporary politics. And that's how at Columbia we started the area studies programs that were designed to attract funds and attention by government agencies, private investors, and also simple scholars, but that could really give back agency to a language that was just like stuck in manuscripts. They were just beautiful manuscripts, but just unread manuscripts. And it was really for me a chance to really shed light on the work of not only the known Edouard Said, Philip Hetty, but also much lesser known librarians who had the power to make not only text, but a whole language visible and make a field relevant. And it was really a chance for me to just, you know, yield the floor back to these fantastic actors of Colombia's academic reputation and history. So yeah, a real odyssey through Arabness via Colombia's forgotten actors.
That's fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah, really, really is fantastic. And Philip Hetty, for those who don't know, is you know, one of the greatest historians, sociologists of the Arab world, and to study this part of the world, one must study Philip Hetty. And I know we're going to hear a great deal about the extraordinary Edward Said
Yes.
later on in the presentation. But thank you, Lydia. And I'm particularly interested in the issue of Arabness and how it's defined and the role of language. And my current book project actually is, the working title of it is The Arab Identity and Its Politics, which really examines Arabness, if you will, at the regional, national, and individual level. So your work is of particular interest to me, as I'm sure it is for many of our audience members. And I'm delighted to know that you're going to be pursuing your graduate studies at NYU. So I look forward to monitoring its progress, and please stay in touch as you do. Dana, back over to you.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to introduce our next student, Kevin Peterson, author of Overcoming Orientalism, among Columbia University's earliest Arab alumni. Kevin Peterson is a recent graduate of Columbia University's School of General Studies, where he studied economics and modern European history. His interest in the Middle East was formed when he moved to Jordan for high school due to his parents' work at the US Embassy in Amman. After learning Arabic in Jordan, he further developed this interest at Columbia University by taking classes on Middle Eastern history and philosophical thought. This summer, he is a research intern at a think tank in Washington, D.C., focusing on foreign policy. Kevin, go ahead.
Thank you, Donna. And thank you to Dr. Mustry as well for the wonderful introduction. So I'm Kevin Peterson, and as mentioned, I'll be presenting my paper, Overcoming Orientalism, among Columbia University's earliest Arab alumni. So very briefly, in this paper, I wrote 3 profiles on 3 amazing and inspiring alumni, Arab alumni of Columbia University: Khalil Abdullah Tota, Mohammed Fadah Jamali, and Alice Mitri Kandalaft. Each of these individuals were born and raised in the Middle East, but they traveled to New York City in the early 20th century to study at Columbia University. And throughout their lives, they did amazing and inspiring works in politics and education and culture. Tota was an educator and a Palestinian independence activist in the United States. Al-Jamali was the Prime Minister of Iraq, and Kandalaft was an ambassador of Syria to the United Nations. At the same time, I also took a look at the changing face of Columbia University throughout this period. In 1892, for example, there were 2 Arab students, one from Syria and one from Egypt. Today, there were 10,000 international students in general, and while I couldn't get a precise number, probably hundreds from the Middle East. So there's a dramatic change in the past 130 years of Arab presence at Columbia University. I just want to briefly discuss 2 parts of my paper. First, the initial reason why I chose this topic, and second, the method through which I researched it. So I came to this topic of a very personal connection. As Dana mentioned, I'm American by birth and heritage, but I grew up and I spent my high school years in Jordan when my parents moved there to work at the US Embassy. And as a result, I had this experience of moving to a new place and having to learn new culture and adapt to a different place. And I thought, when I came to this project, I want to see if I could do something similar for many Arab students that came to the United States, because I imagine they experienced something very similar and probably even more profound than what I experienced myself. So I came with this personal interest of seeing if there's a similar experience, but perhaps in the other direction. With respect to the research, and Dana, if you could show the paper to show some of the pictures, I decided to do this project. I want to first try and find all the Arab alumni of the university. And thankfully, this has helped because Columbia University has been collecting a lot of the names of alumni since about the 1880s. And thankfully, they're also organized by country. So I was able to go through a lot of the countries in the Middle East, find the names of all the students that were recorded that came, and then go name by name, start researching each individual person to see what they did, see what sources was available, and see what kind of story I could bring together. I found books these individuals wrote, columns, even master's and PhD theses. And over time, I was able to find these 3, Tota, Jamali, and Kandalaft, which were profoundly diverse and inspiring. And throughout this process, I also did some contextual research of Columbia University to see what it was like for them to come to New York City and to come to university across the world. And one thing I found is that there's a tension between the diversity of these students. Tota was a Quaker, Kandalaft was a woman growing up in the Middle East going to politics. Al-Jamali, he grew up in an Orthodox Muslim family, but he married across religious lines and he sort of liberalized over time. I found this amazing diversity, but at the same time, sort of this Orientalism on campus. I found this great article, this fascinating article from many decades ago, 5 Turks on campus, Oriental students coming, that really simplified these students and their personalities. And this tension I found sort of unbearable, and I wanted to bring to light the diversity of the students that were coming to the university, despite sort of the simplicity they were being casted as on campus. And I'll say, just looking back, my only regret is that I couldn't write about all the students that were coming to, all the Arab students coming to Columbia University. I had a lot of flexibility of words. I was able to write about 7,000 words about these 3 individuals, but unfortunately, the real constraint was sources. While most of the students had something I could find, it was these 3 that had many books and biographies and columns that I could really rely on, and sort of the reason why I ended up relying on these 3 in particular. But if I had time, if I had more sources, if I could get some more personal oral histories, perhaps there's so many more students that did so many, or alumni that did so many inspirational and impactful things throughout their lives, throughout their time at Columbia, before and after as well, that my paper could be much, much longer. So I'm excited to have this published, and thank you so much for everybody for coming and listening to my presentation.
Thank you, Kevin. Really, really fascinating, and that you were able to pick diversity in the alumni and sort of trace their trajectory, leading up to their studies at Columbia and since. Now, out of personal interest, when you spent your high school years in Jordan, was it at King's Academy?
I was at the American Community School.
Okay, okay, another very fine school. Yeah, fantastic. Dana?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to now introduce our next student, Emily Cohn, author of The Arab World on Low Steps, Colombia Campus Culture Amidst 20th Century Conflicts. Emily is an undergraduate senior in Columbia College, majoring in political science and linguistics, with a language focus in Arabic. She is also Saltzman Student Scholar in International Relations and has held multiple research positions in US Middle Eastern relations. Emily is currently a Fulbright Metax Fellow at the University of Ottawa, conducting research on the intersection of religion, public policy, and law in several countries for a comparative case study. Her other research interests include multilingualism and education policy. Emily.
Thank you so much. So in my project, I studied 3 key periods of Middle Eastern history in the 20th century through the lens of Columbia University students and student life. I was interested in learning how events in the Arab world became intertwined with campus culture and how the student perspectives of the Middle East changed over the century. I chose this topic because I wanted to understand how the average student would experience and engage with the Arab world and their daily life rather than looking at perhaps what they were formally studying or researching. So to reconstruct student life, I used multimedia archives from the Columbia Daily Spectator and supplemented my findings with university reports to get a sense of the makeup of the student body. The Spectator is the oldest student newspaper at Columbia, so it provided an opportunity to see how Columbia students engaged with the Middle East via pictures and descriptions of events, and how they perceived the Arab world via opinion articles and letters to the editors. I was pleasantly surprised by how much material I found. Some of the most fascinating pieces I found were articles detailing protests and physical fights breaking out on campus over controversial speakers, a series of debates around the Israel-Palestine conflict, a satirical poem written in 1922 criticizing colonialism in the Arab world, and interviews with Arab students sharing their perspectives on the issues of the day. The sheer amount of exciting material I found presented my main challenge with this project, which was narrowing down my findings into cohesive time periods. But I ended up choosing 3 time periods in which there was a major shift in how the US interacted with the Arab world. So those periods are 1919 to 1939, when the modern Middle East emerged, 1955 to 1975, during the height of the Cold War in the Israel-Palestine and Egypt conflict, and in 1990 to 2010, which technically goes into the 21st century, but it's focused on the Gulf Wars that began in the 90s. Among my many findings, I found an increasing student interest in the Arab world as time went on. While Columbia students consistently were engaging with the Middle East throughout these time periods, there was an increase in activism aligned with when the US became more involved with the region. There was also consistent diversity of perspectives on the issues of the day. You could truly find any opinion you were looking for in these sources. But especially in the later period of the Gulf Wars, the viewpoints of Arab students themselves on campus were more emphasized in these debates. So since doing this project, I have done other archival research about US relations with the Middle East during the Cold War. So I'd be interested to take the archival research skills that I developed in this first project to future political science research projects as a political science major, where I could examine archives and the important dialogue produced between the US and Arab and Middle Eastern countries. And that is it. So thank you so much for everyone to come, or for coming.
Thank you, Emily. I mean, this is fascinating and so important, and a lot of questions are crossing my mind. I'll pose one to you. But, it's interesting also how at the time, a lot, when you talk about Israel-Palestine, the terminology that was used is no longer used, right? So, for example, at the time, it was considered the Arab-Israeli conflict. And today, it's much more Palestinian and Israeli. And the word conflict has also started disappearing from the lexicon, but because it's not a conflict. I mean, as we've been hearing a lot from Ukrainians who reject the use of the term conflict in in referring to the Russian invasion or occupation. So that I think is I guess it's partially a question. I mean, have you seen a sort of a trend or a pattern in terms of how things evolved, for example, on campus regarding issues that emanate from this part of the world, both in terms of the language that's used or the mechanisms that are used, the tools that are used, but also where the voices and sort of the makeup of those voices. I mean, you mentioned that you could find every opinion conceivable on any of those issues, which is exactly what democracy is about, right? And what an academic institution is and should be about. So I'm curious about your reactions to this.
You're right. I think the biggest change I noticed was a change in language and referring to the Arab world in general over this time period. In the beginning, there was this reference to Near Eastern, and they used the word problems a lot when talking about colonialism in the region. And then as soon as what they did call the Arab-Israeli debate was a huge word at the time. Conflict, I saw a little bit. Issue was probably the most prevalent word, which is interesting because I feel like it kind of implies that it's a nuanced problem rather than something that had a clear side. I thought the language used was fairly objective for the time period, but you definitely see more diversity of thought on the region and current events as you go into that later time period that I mentioned in the 1990s, if that answers your question.
It does. Thank you. Great. Dana?
Yes, thank you. I'd now like to introduce our next student, Iona Tate, author of A Man of Multiple Selves, Edward Said and His Legacy at Columbia. Iona is a student on the MA Masters of Science International and World History program at Columbia University, joint with the London School of Economics. Her research focuses on early 20th century European intellectual and cultural history. Before joining Columbia, she studied French literature at the University of Oxford and spent some time in Beirut learning Arabic. She will graduate in 2023. Iona?
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. My paper explored Edward Said's legacy at Columbia, both intellectually and politically, focusing on his reputation on campus and his understanding of the intellectual, which he believed was by definition public. I wanted to examine the many paradoxes at work in his writing, including his attitudes towards activism, for example. I drew predominantly on Timothy Brennan's recent biography, Places of Mind, as well as conducting interviews with faculty at Columbia, such as Professor Rashid Khalidi, the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies, and Gauri Viswanathan in the Department of Comparative Literature, who studied under Edward Said. And I also consulted Said's own texts. I first looked at Edward Said's secular humanist values in the context of academic freedom. He very much believed in the special status of the university in protecting the professor's right to speak and write and the capacity to dissent. Although that was not uncontroversial at the time, with many of his contemporaries believing that he glorified the university or overlooked some of its shortcomings. That said, many scholars do believe that the university acted with great integrity when Edward Said was there in protecting his position in the wake of several controversies. I also examined his influence on certain disciplines, most notably post-colonialism, which he is said to have founded following the publication of his book, Orientalism, which generated great interest in exploring the cultural legacy of colonialism. However, Said shunned the very discipline that he is said to have founded, with many believing that he had a rather ambivalent or perhaps negative attitude towards that discipline. I also explored the imprint that his interest in Middle Eastern studies had on the university with the founding of the Center of Palestine Studies in 2010, which is the first institute in an academic university in the United States to explore Palestine. So many believe that Edward Said enabled Palestine to become a term of scholarly discourse. However, some do believe that perhaps we can see him more as a translator, as bringing into light the work of many other Arab scholars around him or who studied before him. And my final section was on his political impact, most notably with regards to Palestine and the political discourse at Columbia. An interesting effect of this is that Columbia has a more progressive student body and faculty with regards to questions on Palestine compared to other Ivy League universities, with the exception of Brown. However, the erasure of Edward Said's Palestinian identity was prevalent at his time and persists, which is very notable in the reviews of Timothy Brennan's book, and many do not mention that his identity at all, which is very striking. But an interesting irony or paradox with regards to Said's political commitment is his undeniable elitism, or his reticence towards activism. He definitely slightly looked down on student activism at his time, with many sort of funny anecdotes about not supporting some strikes and protests. But that said, Said has definitely been embedded in today's student politics. So my paper overall looked at the many facets of Said's life and how they were in deep dialogue together, and that despite his ironies, or perhaps because of his ironies, he was a sort of colossal intellectual, perhaps a fine example of an academic celebrity at Columbia, with his legacy very noticeable both in the context of the disciplines, such as world literature and comparative literature, studies on Palestine, but also the political climate surrounding Palestine. And we can see his legacy perhaps in smaller ways, such as the Edward Said reading room in the Butler Library, where you have access to his whole collection, which is a wonderful addition to the library, as well as the Edward Said Fellowships in Humanities, which I think is testament to his appeal across disciplinary boundaries. Thank you.
Wow. Wow. I mean, to be able to capture some of the essence of Edward in this is a phenomenal feat, Iona. He was a very complex person. He was a person who was larger than life in many, many respects. People oftentimes don't realize that he was a professor of comparative literature, that is what his academic home was, because he was known for so much more, particularly on the question of Palestine. He was one of the most vocal and articulate presenters of the struggle for Palestinians. He died in 2003, and his dying wish was to have Rashid Khalidi come and join Colombia from the University of Chicago after while he was on his deathbed. Basically, colleagues and friends and philanthropists put together the fund for the chair, the Edward Said chair, which Rashid Khalidi has occupied since. And you're absolutely correct in that he drew a lot of great scholars to Columbia, and that subsequent to his death led to the establishment of the Center for Palestine Studies. His legacy lives in every classroom, in every book related to the work that he did. And the fellowship that you mentioned, which I have been incredibly proud to have been associated with on the steering committee for every year. We get enormous numbers of applications from scholars, young scholars all over the world who want to come and take advantage of this fellowship to spend as much time as they can at the Columbia campus, going through the archival material that Edward had left behind. So thank you, Iona, and Dana. Let's make sure that we share this piece also with people like Rashid and like Mariam Saeed and Wadia Saeed.
Absolutely.
Back to you, Dana.
Yes, definitely we'll share. And I'd like to remind our audience to please send any questions into the chat box below. We will shortly begin asking questions to our student authors. And unfortunately, our last 3 student authors could not be with us today, but we would still like to share with you a little bit about them and to showcase their work. If you are interested to learn more about their papers, a brief abstract is included at the beginning of the publication, and of course, you're more than welcome to read their actual papers. And now I'd like to share about feminism across the East-West divide, Columbia academics as builders of the bridge. If we could have that on the screen very shortly, thank you. And this is by Suhani Chaudhry. Suhani is a final year BA Social Anthropology student at the London School of Economics. She was a visiting student at Columbia University, and having just finished her year abroad there, she's looking forward to using her experiences in New York as fieldwork for her final year dissertation. Her interest lies in women, gender, and representations in the contemporary world. Having grown up in India and studied in London and New York, Suhani has found an appreciation for the richness and nuance that exist within cultures and societies. She's looking forward to finishing her studies and using her background in social science to change the practices of the media and corporate sectors after she graduates. Here is the rest of her publication. She was really inspired by Layla Abuloghod's work and Nina Berman's photography, and Natalie Hamdal, of course, in her poetry. Following that, Teachers College and Education Reform in Jordan was written by Ala Qarouni. Ala graduated from Teachers College in 2019. He is finishing up his second master's in Columbia's new dual MA program in Muslim Cultures and Islamic Studies, which is co-hosted by the Middle East Institute at Columbia and the Aga Khan Center in London. During his time at Columbia, he helped facilitate a professional development workshop for high school social studies teachers, and this was intended to inspire them to include Middle Eastern history and culture in their curricula. And he also volunteered to be a facilitator for the Gaza on Screen Film Festival. And lastly, the power of proximity, how the Columbia Global Center in Amman empowered Columbia University's research and support of Syrian refugees by Sophia Fulton. Sophia is an MPA candidate at Columbia SIPA, studying international security policy, international conflict resolution, and the Middle East. She is a Rangel Fellow with the Department of State and will join the Foreign Service after completing her graduate degree. Before coming to Columbia, she worked on Capitol Hill for a national security think tank and at the Department of State. She's working this summer at the US mission to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And I'd like to take a moment to thank the students who are with us today. And we will be taking audience questions. And if Professor Safwan, you have any questions, further questions you'd like to ask?
Thank you. I'm sorry that the last 3 presenters were not here, but again, the abstracts and the full articles are available on the publication. A couple of people have asked about access to the publications, and I know that information was shared, but maybe you can share it again, Dana.
Yes, absolutely. The publication will be available on our website very shortly. And I'll see if it could go out also with a recording of this webinar afterwards.
Okay, great. So do you want to take some questions from the audience? I mean, there aren't really many. There are a couple of questions regarding funding opportunities for graduate school and scholarships. And I'm not sure, Dana, if you want to deal with that. I mean, this is not the forum for this, and it all depends on the particular school. In general, financial aid for international students, I think, is slim at all US universities, but your best bet is to ask the admissions office, the admissions financial aid office that you're interacting with at the school that you're applying to, and they will be able to tell you what is available, what's not available in terms of scholarships and financial aid. I don't see any questions that relate to the particular content of the presentations, but let us maybe open it up for a discussion among the students. Do you have any questions for any of the rest of you? Like, curiosity about how your teammates in creating this publication may have gone about their research, challenges that they faced, things that they learned about themselves in going through the research. Yes, please, Kevin.
Yes, so I have a question for, I believe, Emily. So about your research and your process, I think there might be a little bit of a similarity. I myself focused a lot on a lot of the resources of the alumni register and also the Colombia Daily Spectator, looking through the archives. And I'm curious what approach you took. It seemed like you relied a lot on the Spectator as well to find the articles that you were writing about, finding the trends that you were highlighting, and specifically sort of how you sort of found it from the sources you were looking at.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I remember you talked about using the university reports too. For the university reports, I just went through all of the years I could find, and like you did, looked and noted how many Arab students were on campus, and that kind of helped inform the campus makeup at the years I was looking at. And then for the Colombia Daily Spectator archives, there's a wonderful website with all the archives, as I'm sure you know, with all of the articles ever published by Spectator to, I forget what year it starts, but for a very long time. There's no formal way I did it. I just searched up every single word relating to the Middle East, the Arab world, which is how I also noticed the change in language used, because there is practically nothing using the word Arab in the first time period I mentioned, around like 1919. So that's where the word Near Eastern came into play. But yeah, there was nothing formal to it. I just read every single article related to the Middle East through those time periods.
Thank you both. Lydia, you look like you're about to ask something or say something.
Yes, I wanted to ask Kevin, how did you select these spotlights? What was the criteria you had in mind to put the spotlight on these specific characters of Colombia's history? I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's sort of two parts of it. Of course, the first one is I want to find people who had impact that's sort of not very well known, for example. So there's these individuals, and it's sort of surprising how little comprehensive histories there are about these three individuals for the magnitude of things they did. One thing I found interesting is, for example, Fatah al-Jamali, he received an honorary doctorate from Columbia University, and I never found that online. I found that by requesting the information from the alumni office to see his file, and in the file I found his honorary degree. So there's still a little bit, it's hard to find everything together. So the two sort of criteria I ended up choosing things, of course, looking for people who had impact. Of course, a prime minister, somebody that's sort of very big, an ambassador. And unfortunately, a second criteria was amount of sources. So there are a lot of people I could find one thing they did, one book they wrote, one thesis. These individuals in particular, however, had autobiographies, they had diaries, their kids wrote books about them. So it was also an issue of finding the right sources and having them accessible. And these three in particular were one of the more easier people to write about, but also most impactful.
Fantastic, really great idea. Spotlight some lesser known characters.
Yeah. So there's a question for you, Lydia, from an anonymous member of the audience, asking if you could expand on your reflections on the different notions of Arabness that came up in your research. How did definitions of Arab differ or change across space and time? So, yeah.
Yes, I can try. I mean, from the interviews I had the chance to like collect, I really mainly had different ideas from political realities that interviewees experience. For example, Syrian, Iraqi interviewees were mainly like linking Arab to the Ba'ath Party and the Arabization of history, for example, while others looked at Arab as more of a blanket sort of concept that sometimes could erase characteristics in name of a constructed uniformity. But at the same time, it always seems to like convey a sort of solidarity between different linguistic dialects. There's a sort of link that bonds all Arabic speaking people together that always comes up. But I think that one of the most interesting part was this really will and drive to write the history of the Arab world from an Arab perspective. And I think that Colombia is doing a very good job at it with all the various centers like Center for Palestine Studies and CSMS and MEI. And I think that Arabness probably is an empty identifier, but it has a sort of I would say, performative value in creating solidarity and different collaborations.
Interesting. Interesting. I mean, in what you just said about creating solidarity, you know, of course, at the grassroots level, it's very, very different than it is at the state level, right? There's a question about what defines Arab, right? I mean, it's not an ethnic group necessarily, and if it is, then once you leave the southern peninsula, right, what is today Yemen, Saudi Arabia, it got mixed with a lot of other cultures during the Islamic al-Futuhat al-Islamiyya, or the spread of Islam in the 7th century and beyond. It came across, you know, Byzantines and Assyrians and Babylonians and Egyptians and Berber and, you know, all kinds of cultures that existed. And, you know, language is also a very interesting question, because it is the formal Arabic, the Arabic of the Quran, that is common, but it's not spoken. It's not, that's not how we communicate with one another. And, you know, there are questions also about different regions within what's considered to be the Arab world. There's the Levant, there's the Nile Valley, there is the Gulf region, there is North Africa, and, you know, there's more that differentiates those different regions than
I think it's a textual unity around standard Arabic, for example, or Quranic Arabic. And the Arabness is mainly, I think, a textual definition.
Yes, yes. So here's another question, I think, for any of you, and I think it's a fascinating question. Do you have any recommendations regarding a more comprehensive approach to documenting the Arab experience at Colombia, both historically and going forward? And are there gaps, areas of interest that you may have identified that you think should be better documented in the collections and archives? Did you identify any gaps? Do you have any recommendations for how this should be documented? Lydia, take it, but then let's also
I should think, okay.
From Iona, Emily, I see Kevin has his hand up. So go ahead, Lydia, and then we go to Kevin.
Yes, I was like, one main, I would say, lack, I would say, in this research was the lack of Arabic sources specifically. I mean, the library has fantastic resources, but not a lot of really Arabic language resources. And I would say that it would be fantastic, this is a question for you, Professor Safwan, to start maybe a center on Arabness, or a seminar on thinking and defining Arabness at Colombia.
So, as I mentioned at the beginning, after 34 phenomenal years at Colombia, my tenure at Colombia is coming to an end. So I have nothing
so
to
maybe
say
extra
about that.
Colombian.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Middle East Institute, even though it's not Arab focused, and it's really the Middle East that it focuses on, but not the entire Middle East. I mean, but there is also a separate institute for Israel and Jewish studies at Columbia, but the Middle East Institute is the home for a lot of work on the Arab world, and perhaps a connection with the Middle East Institute. I don't know if anybody from the Middle East Institute is attending this, but I think Dana sharing this, as I'm sure you have or will, with Ingrid and other people at the Institute would be very helpful. Yeah. Ian Balin from the Columbia Library. Hi, Ian. Ian has worked with the Amman Center, is actually on the steering committee for the Mellon Fellowship Program for Displaced Emerging Scholars. He's asking, as a librarian at Butler Library, he was delighted to hear about how useful the library was to your research. He's asking if you could say a little more, and it's for you, Lydia, about how you made these discoveries and how you learned about the provenance of the materials that you found. But anybody else can also share in Lydia's answer. Go ahead, Lydia. And Kevin, I never got back to you. Sorry, before we even answer Ian's question. Kevin, I think you had something to add to the previous question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll just say, so one thing I relied on a lot, especially in terms of the experience, was personal memoirs, even some letters I could find online. And that was something in particular for very accessible for Farhad Jamali and Khalil Tote. They wrote a lot of diaries that their families published it. And beyond that, it was difficult to get a lot of the experiential sort of information. There's a lot of theses online. I could find an alumni. I could read a thesis from 1930, but it's hard to get, of course, the experience, what that individual learned or experienced or changed. So I'm not sure if there's a way to do this, but if there's, I imagine a lot of these alumni wrote throughout their lives, wrote home, maintained diaries, but if there's families that could contribute, if there could be access to perhaps sort of foundations that might maintain locally some of these bits of information, that was what was particularly useful for me to learn about how they changed their thoughts. It's just, of course, by the nature of that document, harder to get access to.
Yeah, got it. Thank you. So Lydia, back to you. Ian's question about Butler Library and how you learned about the, as he says, the provenance of the materials that you found.
So I had fantastic guides at the library, mainly Jane Siegel, fantastic librarian and manuscripts expert at the library. And it was really from footnote to footnote that I found provenance of these manuscripts. And also via the amazing archive of the Spectators, Colombia's oldest journal, that really reported the travels of these Orientalist professors who would go to Jerusalem and Beirut and write about their experiences and what manuscript they found on their trips before doing a conference in Butler Library, for example. So it was mainly through conversations and tiny footnotes.
It's great. Now there is, I guess, somewhat provocative question, or two questions in one, by an anonymous attendee asking, and maybe Iona, you can help answer this question. I'll give my views on it. The person is asking, I wonder what you think Edward Said's political stance, particularly on the question of Palestine, would be today if he was still alive. Would he still be vocal if he hadn't had the Princeton and Columbia labels? I mean, first of all, I think neither Princeton nor Columbia made Edward Said, and one can argue Princeton is where he got his PhD, and one can argue with a lot of conviction that he actually brought a lot of prominence to Columbia. I mean, Columbia had always been prominent, of course, and will always will be, but I think he was at Columbia and he went to Princeton because he was Edward Said. okay, not the other way around. I think that it was to Colombia's great credit and advantage that he based himself there and created the legacy that he did. When I joined Colombia in 1988, even though I had come out of engineering at Stanford and I joined the business school as an assistant professor at Columbia, Edward Said was a big draw. And I'm always grateful to the couple of hours he spent with me, giving me advice as I was considering joining the faculty at Columbia or going elsewhere. And at the time, there were a number of universities that were fighting over him, including Harvard, Stanford, and Columbia. And he ended up being at Columbia and created a phenomenal legacy. Would he be vocal today? Of course. I mean, you know, Edward is vocal today. 19 years after his passing, he is still vocal, and he is invoked in many important conversations, and he left legacies behind that are very much active and very much alive. But Iona or anyone else who would like to address this?
Yeah, I think another way of looking at it also is that the university protected him and enabled him to be vocal about his views on Palestine, and in the name of academic freedom. So I think you can see the university as enabling him to speak in that way. And we see today examples of untenured professors, you know, not being able to speak about Palestine or other political issues that people believe to be controversial. So I think we can see the university as helping him in that regard. And I think he would, I mean, hard to know, obviously, but I think he would be vocal about support for Palestine. And, you know, there is evidence that he gave support to the divestment and boycotting of Israeli settlements later in his life. So you can see there was a referendum with the Columbia student body on BDS, and you can see that as building on Said's own work, perhaps.
Right. And, you know, the way that I think a very important part of history that you're alluding to is when Jonathan Cole, who was provost at in the 1990s, came to the defense of Edward when there were entities and a few faculty who, you know, asked the university to fire him, basically. And Jonathan wrote a fantastic piece that was published in the New York Times, coming to Edward's defense and to the defense of freedom of expression.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it was in 2000, some photos emerged, and people wanted to expel Said, but he was protected by us.
And no, the anonymous attendee, you know, is no need to, no, on the contrary, provocative is good. I mean, provocative in that it's provoking conversation. So, you know, don't feel bad at all. On the contrary, thank you for the questions. To provoke is to create an opportunity to have the kind of conversation that we are having. So thank you for it. On the contrary, Muna Khalidi, my good friend Muna Khalidi, herself a former dean at Columbia and the wife of Rashid Khalidi, is asking about Arab student organizations and activism. I think, Muna, we would, you know, students should come to you to find out more information, but there are many organizations, of course, Turath at the undergraduate, at the college. There are organizations at the law school, at SIPA. There is Yalla at the business school. I think maybe, Dana, one thing to perhaps as an addendum to the publication is a list of all, you know, organizations that have to do with the region. We have that information at the global centers because a couple of years ago we collected information on all organizations on campus that attract students from from the various regions in which we have the global center. So it's something you can easily share. Emily.
I was going to note that the development of these Arab student unions and organizations is a huge focus of my paper, and how they got involved with activism, starting from a few Arab students in a large union called, I forget the name, but it's of students from all Asian countries, which sounds very broad, but when you remember that there were 2 Arab students, it makes sense why they would have been in a larger organization. But it traces the foundation of clubs such as the Arab Student Union to more recent clubs like Tarath, and how these student organizations became a player in protests and activism on campus, but also in New York City in general. So that was a very broad answer, but that is a large focus of my paper as well.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Emily. Dana, I think we are just about at time, maybe 1 minute over time. So I'm going to turn it over to you to close, but this has been spectacular. Thank you, guys. I'm honored to know each of you, and I'm really grateful for the work that you've done, and very grateful to you, Dana, for curating and for shepherding and guiding this process. Really, this is fantastic work that I hope future generations will build upon and will benefit from. And I know each of you is going to do great things in your lives, and I look forward to continuing to learn about your trajectories. So thank you. Dana?
Thank you very much, Professor Safwan. And thank you for joining us today and for your involvement in this event and in many other events in the publication itself. It enriches it all. And I'd like to thank our student authors for being with us today also, Lydia Hilu, Emily Cohn, Iona Tate, and Kevin Peterson. Sorry, your names are in the order you are on my screen. And it is unfortunate that our other 3 student authors couldn't be with us here, but they were with us in spirit. And we really encourage everyone in our audience to see the student publication, to read the papers, to really reflect on the words that are on the page and on the pictures that were provided. It was a very intense process that took a lot of months, and the students put in a lot of research, a lot of thought, and it really paid off. We're very proud of everyone's contributions for this paper. Thank you very much. And we'd also like to thank our audience for being with us today. And once again, we will be sharing the publication on our website. It will be available very soon. And yeah, it's been a fantastic experience working with everyone.
Thank you, Dana, and thank you for giving up time on your birthday. Happy birthday again.